Hey, Katie. We have The Whispering Statue. We are on Chapter 3, The Ambush. Half an hour later, Nancy decided to call the Fanes to see if George was home. Good idea, Hannah replied. If she and Bess aren't home, get in touch with the police. Nancy dialed the Fane number, but could not hear a ring. She put the phone down, then picked it up. There was no dial tone. I'm afraid our line is out of order, she told Hannah. Nancy began to pace the room while the housekeeper sat in a living room chair staring straight ahead. Finally, she said, Maybe your father tried to phone here and couldn't reach us. Nancy nodded. She was alarmed for the safety of her father and the girls because of what had occurred earlier at the house. Suddenly, she stopped pacing. A car was coming up the driveway. Nancy ran to the kitchen and turned on the light. Her father was home. She greeted him at the back door. We were so worried about you, Dad, she said. Did something happen? He smiled. I've had an interesting adventure, he replied. Come into the living room and I'll tell you about it. Nancy and Hannah were not too surprised to learn that the lawyer had been followed when he left the house with Bess and George. I decided it might be a good idea if the men trailing me didn't know where the girls live, so we all went to a soda shop. As he paused, Nancy asked, And then? Her father said he was sure friends of Bess and George would be in the shop, and glad to take the girls home separately. If I were followed, I could play a game of hare and hounds and get away. And you did? Hannah Gruen asked. Finally, he answered. By the way, I tried to phone here, but the line was dead. I found that out too, Nancy told him. Dad, were you followed after you left the soda shop? Yes, I thought of dodging through the very streets to lose my pursuers, but decided on a better idea. He chuckled. My plan worked. The instant the two men in the car tailing mine saw me head for the door of police headquarters, they went down the street so fast I didn't even get their license number. Clever, Hannah remarked. Well, I'm glad you're safe and sound, and now I'll say good night. Nancy and her father remained on the first floor. Do you suppose, Nancy asked, that our phone line might have been cut? I'll go out and take a look, her father replied. I'll be glad when all the phone wires have been put underground. Then this can't happen. The outside line for the Drews' telephone ran overhead from the street and down the side of the house. The beam of a flashlight revealed that it had indeed been cut. The phone company can't repair it until the morning, Mr. Drew told Nancy. But in the meantime, I'll see what kind of electrician I can be. I'll attempt to splice this wire so we can call the police and report what happened. So he's trying to put the wire back together. He was successful, though the connection proved to be scratchy and jumpy. Nevertheless, his message was understood by the sergeant on duty at the headquarters desk. Then Mr. Drew called the telephone company's repair service department. Early the next morning, two men arrived to replace the damaged wire. As soon as they left, Nancy phoned Bess and George. I think it would be safer if you don't come here before we leave on our trip. Whoever followed Dad got a pretty good look at you girls. We'll meet at the airport tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I won't leave the house before going. When we get together again, I'll be Miss Debbie Lynbrook. Please don't act surprised. The cousins agreed to the arrangement and said they could not wait to see Nancy in disguise. Are you going to order your wig over the phone? Bess asked. Yes, and I'll have it delivered here. After breakfast, Mr. Drew suggested that Mrs. Merriam not go back to her own home until her husband returned. She agreed to stay with a friend. A short while later, a taxi came to take her to the airport. As she said goodbye to the Drews and Hannah Gruen, she again expressed her appreciation for their hospitality and said she was looking forward to the girls' visit to Waterford. I don't believe we should be seen together there, Nancy said. Regretfully, Mrs. Merriam agreed. But we'll be talking on the phone, she said. Nancy spent the day packing, writing some letters, and going over the various angles of Mrs. Merriam's mystery. Mrs. Gruen had become very quiet, and Nancy knew she was worrying as she always did whenever the young detective took on a new mystery. Finally, Nancy put an arm around the housekeeper and smiled. "If I seem to be running into danger, Bess and George will stop me. Besides that, I promise to be careful." As she finished speaking, the front doorbell rang. For a second, Nancy and Hannah wondered if one of their enemies might be returning. Before opening the door, they peered outside, then both began to laugh. Ned Nickerson was standing there. Ned was a special friend of Nancy's and dated her whenever he could get away from either college or his part-time summer job of selling insurance. Nancy opened the door. "Hi," she said as he stepped inside. Seeing the look of relief in her eyes, as well as Hannah's, he asked, "Whom were you expecting? A burglar?" "Yes," Mrs. Gruen replied. "Nancy will tell you about our experiences with a couple of masked intruders." "What?" exclaimed the tall, handsome football player from Emerson College. He was amazed to hear about the two mysteries Nancy was about to try solving at Waterford. "Good night," he exclaimed. "You sound as if you might need a little male assistance. Don't be surprised if I show up at the yacht club." Nancy grinned. "Have you lost your insurance job?" she teased. "Not up to an hour ago," he replied. "But seriously, don't be surprised if I arrive at the yacht club for the weekend." "Wonderful," Nancy replied. "Let's make it definite. And how about bringing Bert and Dave with you?" Bert Edelson and Dave Evans were friends of George and Bess. They, too, attended Emerson. "I'll get in touch with them," Ned promised. Nancy told Ned of her plain disguise and change of name. "Warn the other two boys not to give me away," she said. "Would you like to meet Debbie Lynbrook?" "I thought I was talking to her," Ned replied. Nancy asked him to sit down in the living room while she put on her disguise. She hurried upstairs and unpacked the wig which had been delivered an hour before. She had applied the tanning lotion early that morning and now dusted dark powder on her face and neck, then adjusted the long black wig, pulling the sides of it over her cheeks. The finishing touch was a pair of horn-rimmed sunglasses. Walking into the living room, Nancy said in a voice a couple tones higher than her own, "How do you like Debbie's hair?" Ned burst into laughter. "I certainly never recognized you. And that voice is perfect. Say, when I come to see you Saturday, do you think I should wear a wig and change my voice?" "You stay the way you are," Nancy replied. Ned joined the family for dinner, but left soon afterward. Nancy went to bed early, eager for the next day when she could start working on the Whispering Statue mystery and trying to find out more about Willis Basswood. In the morning, she met Bess and George at the airport. The cousins had difficulty keeping their faces straight, especially when Nancy spoke in her assumed voice. The three girls looked around to see if they were being observed, but decided they were not. The plane trip proved to be uneventful. When the jet landed, the girls were the only passengers to alight. The place was almost as deserted, and there were no taxis. But presently a man drove up in a station wagon and jumped out. On the front of the cap he wore were the initials WYC. "You girls going to the yacht club?" he asked. When they said yes, he said, "Jump in. I'll put your bags in the back." The highway ran directly to the ocean front. Here the driver turned left and drove for some distance. The area was uninhabited and the roads were heavy with sand. After a while, the car went up a weed-choked driveway toward a large, weather-beaten house. On the ocean side of it, sand dunes ran down to the water's edge. As the driver headed for the entrance, George whispered to the other girls, "This is no yacht club." "You're right," said Nancy. "We've been tricked. Get out of as fast as you can and follow me." When the car slowed down, the girls opened the doors and scrambled out. The driver instantly began blowing his horn. As the girls ran down the dunes toward the beach, two men came from the house. The three strangers jumped into a small car nearby and started to give chase, bumping down the hillside. "Oh, they'll catch us!" Bess wailed. "We must change our direction," Nancy said quickly. "They won't be able to turn around very fast in this sand." She headed back up the incline. At once, the men leaped from their car and ran after the fleeing girls. Oh, I have to find out what happened.